Imagine you are standing near a bonfire, 40,000 years before the Common Era. The sun has just set, there are no streetlights, there is no electricity, there is nothing but you, the fire, and the thick darkness surrounding you. And somewhere out there in that darkness, there is a group of other creatures also sitting around another bonfire, having done this for 400,000 years, longer than the existence of humankind. Then the two groups see each other. This is not a story from a textbook. This is a true story, the kind that science has only just begun to piece together from bones, from DNA, from the fragmented pieces of evidence lying in the earth tens of thousands of years before anyone thought of digging them up. Because this is something no one tells you straight. We did not win in the way you think. There was no decisive battle. There was no single moment when Homo sapiens stood on the corpse of the enemy and declared victory. What actually happened was stranger, darker, and in some sense, much more interesting. Let us start from the beginning. 100,000 years ago, this Earth was not ours alone, not even close, and this is something no one really sits down to calculate for you. When Homo sapiens was still struggling to exist in Africa, there were at least 5 to 6 other human species living in other places on the same planet. Not separated by tens of thousands of kilometers in the sense of each in their own land, overlapping. The same forest, the same river, the same herd of prey. Neanderthals in Europe and West Asia, Denisovans in Asia, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, and Homo erectus stretching from Africa all the way to Southeast Asia. To understand how ancient Homo erectus was, try putting this number into context. They appeared about 2 million years ago. All that we call human history, every city ever built, every war ever fought, every language ever spoken, is contained in just the last few thousand years. Put that entire history on the timeline of Homo erectus, and it looks like a footnote in the corner of the page. They were the first species to have bodies that really looked human. Long legs, short arms, a skeletal structure designed for walking and running on open terrain. The first humans to leave Africa. Their stone tools barely changed for hundreds of thousands of years, and that may sound like a lack of creativity, but it is actually the opposite. What they made worked so well there was no pressure to change it. If it is not broken, do not fix it. They lived by that principle for 2 million years. Then there was Homo floresiensis. This is the species you need to hear about because it shows how strange this planet of multiple human species was. About 1 meter tall, brain the size of a grapefruit. Living alongside Komodo dragons, giant storks and dwarf elephants on the island of Flores in Indonesia, isolated for hundreds of thousands of years. Island isolation does strange things to creatures. Large species shrink, small species grow larger, and sometimes the result is something that does not fit any pattern. When their remains were discovered in 2003, the first reaction of many scientists was not amazement. It was skepticism. They thought this was a modern human suffering from some kind of developmental disease or deformity. It took many years and many subsequent excavations for the scientific community to accept the simple truth. This was an entirely separate human species that had lived and died on that island, while the rest of the world had no idea they existed. And that is only what we have found. In 2015, archaeologists excavated the remains of a Neanderthal in a cave in southern France and named him Thorin. When they analyzed the DNA, they discovered something no one expected. He belonged to an entirely alien Neanderthal lineage from all the other Neanderthal groups living around him, groups only a few days' walk away. As if two parallel worlds existed right next to each other without ever really touching. No communication, no exchange, nothing. If even Neanderthal groups did not communicate with each other like that, then what happened when Homo sapiens entered the picture? This is not a story about one species defeating another. This is a story about what happens when parallel worlds suddenly collide, and no one has a script for that situation. The first instinct of humans when meeting strangers, it turns out, is not to kill. Before we get to the evidence, let us clear up a misunderstanding that has lasted a century. Neanderthals were not stupid cave people walking hunched over and grunting incomprehensibly. Their brains on average were larger than ours. Stocky and powerful build, broad rib cage, thick bones, heavy brow ridges and large nose to warm cold air before it reached the lungs, a perfect engineering solution for surviving European winters. They hunted mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses at close range to the point their bones carried injuries like those of modern rodeo athletes. They knew how to use fire, made sophisticated tools, and there is increasing evidence they buried their dead. They existed for more than 300,000 years in Europe and West Asia. When someone calls another person a Neanderthal as an insult, they are insulting the wrong person. Now with that foundation, let us talk about what happened when Homo sapiens met them. In 2024, a Princeton research team used an AI tool called IBD Mix to analyze the genomes of 2,000 modern people along with 3 Neanderthal samples and 1 Denisovan sample. The result? Not one interbreeding event, not 2, but 3 separate waves spanning 200,000 years. The first wave from 200 to 250,000 years ago. The second wave from 100 to 120,000 years ago. The largest wave from 50 to 60,000 years ago. Professor Joshua Akey summarized the result in one concise sentence. For most of human history, we had a continuous history of contact with Neanderthals. Not a single encounter, a relationship lasting 200,000 years. Also in 2024, scientists decoded the genome of the oldest Homo sapiens ever found from a site in Ranis, Germany. Not the genome of one individual, but of an entire family group. Mother, daughter, and many distant relatives, all living 45,000 years ago. Their genome carried 2.9% Neanderthal DNA from an interbreeding event that occurred 80 generations before they died. Another woman in Zlatý Kun, Czech Republic, a distant relative of the Ranis group, carried traces from the same event. 2 people, 2 countries, the same moment in DNA. Then there are the Denisovans, the most mysterious species in this story. Their entire existence was discovered from a piece of finger bone excavated in a cave in the Altai Mountains, Siberia, so small it fit in the palm of the hand. The DNA extracted from that piece of bone did not match Neanderthals, did not match Homo sapiens, an entirely new branch of the human family. Even though they left almost no fossils, modern Melanesians carry up to 6% Denisovan DNA in them. 6% from a species for which the entire physical evidence we have is one piece of finger bone. For decades, the idea of interbreeding between different human species was considered too strange to take seriously. Then in 2010, the first Neanderthal genome was decoded, and the question was no longer whether it happened. The question was how many times. The evidence is not in caves, it is in you. All of this happened in the same time period, from 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. The same world, the same time. But not every encounter ended that way. 200,000 years, 3 waves, thousands of generations. This was not a chance meeting. This was a relationship, longer than the entire history of human civilization combined. And this is where the story gets darker. In Belgium, in a cave system called the Troisième Caverne of Goyer archaeologists, excavated the largest assemblage of Neanderthal remains ever found in northern Europe. 6 skeletons, 4 women and adolescent girls particularly short and slender, 2 children, dated from 41,000 to 45,000 years ago. A study published in Scientific Reports in 2025, the result of 10 years of analysis combining ancient DNA, radiocarbon dating, isotope measurements, and virtual morphological reconstruction from hundreds of broken bone fragments. And what they found on those bone fragments is not easy to read. Cut marks, not random cut marks. Systematic cuts in exactly the positions you see when someone is separating meat from bone, identical to what was found on animal bones butchered by the same group of people in the same cave. But the truly shocking discovery was not the cut marks. It was the result of the isotope analysis. When scientists analyzed the chemical composition in the bones of the 6 victims, they discovered all of them were outsiders. None belonged to the local community. All came from the same different geographic region. And none of them showed signs of much movement on the bones. They were not people who were traveling when captured. They came from somewhere else, were brought here, and never left. The researchers suggest they may have been brought alive, killed near the cave, and only specific body parts were taken inside, mainly leg bones. The rest were not found anywhere. To understand why this matters, it is necessary to distinguish 2 completely different things. Endocannibalism is eating people within the same group, often associated with funeral rituals, found in many cultures, and not necessarily carrying violent meaning. What happened at Goyer was exocannibalism, eating outsiders, strangers, people from other groups, and in most recorded anthropological contexts, this behavior is associated with war and intergroup conflict. Then there is the detail about the selection of victims, 4 women and children. Not adult men capable of fighting. Targeting women and children is not random. In many recorded intergroup conflict contexts, from the Neolithic onward, this is a deliberate strategy to undermine the reproductive capacity of the opposing group. You do not need to kill all their men. You only need to ensure their next generation is not born. This happened at exactly the period when Neanderthals in northern Europe were living at the same time as Homo sapiens, both hunting the same prey, sharing the same land resources, in a period of unstable climate where resources were becoming increasingly scarce. And this is the question science has not yet been able to answer. Who was the perpetrator at Goyet? Neanderthals from another group attacking the local group, or Homo sapiens expanding into Europe? We do not know. The evidence is not sufficient to conclude. Goyet is also not the only evidence of violence from this period. The bone of one Neanderthal at Saint-Césaire, France, dated about 40,000 years ago, has a fracture on the top of the skull from a sharp object. Another individual has a stab wound in the left rib. It also cannot be determined who caused them. We do not know who did these things, but we know that 45,000 years ago in a cave in Belgium, there were Neanderthal children who were taken away and never returned. And that is part of the story no one wants to put in textbooks. So what really killed the Neanderthals? The answer is, there was not one single thing. And that is precisely what is interesting. For decades, the default answer was that Homo sapiens was smarter and therefore won. That answer is neat, easy to understand, and almost certainly wrong. In 2024, a study in PNAS directly compared the amount of blood nourishing the cognitive cortex of both species, the part actually related to complex thinking. The result? There was no significant difference. One of the authors summarized it bluntly. Evidence of Neanderthal intellectual inferiority simply does not exist. So if it was not intelligence, then what? What has more evidence is the way each species organized its social life. Homo sapiens maintained networks connecting groups, tools, techniques, knowledge moved between communities hundreds of kilometers apart. Neanderthals lived in small, relatively isolated groups. When one Homo sapiens group faced crisis, their knowledge had already spread elsewhere beforehand. When one Neanderthal group died, what they knew died with them. Thorin is the most specific example. Full DNA analysis published in 2024 showed his lineage had been completely genetically isolated for 50,000 years, no interbreeding with any other Neanderthal groups even a few days' walk away. The researchers explained the consequences very bluntly. When isolated for long periods, the ability to adapt to climate change and new pathogens decreases. You do not need anyone to kill you if you have isolated yourself to the point you no longer have enough capacity to deal with the new. Then there is the disease factor. When Homo sapiens came into contact with Neanderthals, they brought pathogens their immune systems had adapted to over many generations. Neanderthals had not. Not much different from the year 1492 when Europeans arrived in the Americas. Even without direct violence, the contact alone could be disastrous for one side, and even the interbreeding had a biological cost. A study in Scientific Reports in 2025 found that the Neanderthal RHD variant was incompatible with Homo sapiens. Hybrid offspring were prone to hemolytic disease and had low survival rates. Interspecies love also had its price, and that price was measured in generations. Behind it all was the climate, something no one controls. Neanderthals had survived dozens of ice ages over 300,000 years. But climate combined with poorer social networks, combined with genetic isolation, combined with new diseases, combined with difficult-to-survive hybrids, no species could withstand all of that at once. Neanderthals did not lose a battle. They lost a biological war lasting tens of thousands of years, and in that war the strongest weapons were not spears, but time, disease, and love. But disappeared is the wrong word. They did not disappear, they transformed. When scientists began mapping the detailed segments of Neanderthal DNA still remaining in modern people, what they found was not random fragments scattered throughout the genome. Those segments were concentrated in very specific positions, and those positions show why they still exist after 40,000 years, while most Neanderthal DNA had been gradually removed by natural selection. TLR genes, the genes coordinating the initial immune response when the body encounters new pathogens. HLA-A alleles, the most important part of the human body's pathogen recognition system. From 50 to 95% of non-African modern people carry at least one HLA-A allele of Neanderthal origin. That number is not random. It is a sign of natural selection at work, retaining what is useful and eliminating what is not. Besides the immune system, Neanderthal DNA is also concentrated in genes related to skin pigmentation, cold tolerance, and metabolism, things that helped Homo sapiens adapt to the temperate and cold environments of Europe and Asia after leaving Africa. But not everything they left was beneficial. Some Neanderthal alleles in modern people are associated with higher risk of autoimmune diseases, the immune system reacting too strongly and attacking the body itself. Legacy is not always a gift. Sometimes it is something you inherit with no choice. Then there are the Denisovans, the species that left almost no traces in the earth, but left very specific traces in people living today. Tibetans have a gene called EPAS1 that regulates how the body responds to low oxygen at high altitudes. In most people living long on the Tibetan plateau, where the air has only about 60% of the oxygen compared to sea level, would lead to polycythemia, thickened blood, increased risk of stroke and heart failure. Tibetans do not suffer that. And the reason is that the EPAS1 in Tibetans is not a Homo sapiens variant. It came from Denisovans, passed on through interbreeding tens of thousands of years ago. Without that gene, the Tibetan plateau could not have permanent human habitation. A species we can barely find in the earth is literally, in the literal sense, helping millions of people breathe every day. But the farthest discovery in this chain was published in May 2026 in the journal Nature. The research group of Fu and colleagues analyzed tooth enamel proteins from 6 Homo erectus samples excavated in China and found an amino acid variant never seen in any other hominin, a unique molecular signature. Then they found that signature in Denisovans, and then found it in people in the Philippines and Papua New Guinea today. The chain became clear. Homo erectus interbred with Denisovans about 400,000 years ago in East Asia. Denisovans later interbred with Homo sapiens, and that gene continues to live in Southeast Asian people to this day. Homo erectus left Africa 2 million years ago. We thought they disappeared. They did not disappear. They only went around, through Denisovans, through Homo sapiens, and finally to the person reading this. It turns out extinction is a more complex concept than we thought. You cannot go completely extinct if part of you is still going to work, eating rice and reading this. Every species we ever met left a part of themselves in our biological system. The immune system you use to fight this winter flu. Part of it is not from Homo sapiens, it is from Neanderthals. They died 40,000 years ago, but they are still protecting you. But not every species was lucky enough to live on in that way. Remember Homo floresiensis, those 1-meter-tall little people living alongside Komodo dragons on the island of Flores that we met at the beginning of the video. There is one detail about them I have not mentioned yet. They existed until about 50,000 years ago, right at the period when Homo sapiens began moving into the Southeast Asia region. On a small island with an already thin population, a species does not need a major disaster to disappear. Sometimes new pressure appears and a small population simply runs out of time before it can adapt. Homo luzonensis in the Philippines was the same, existed until about 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, disappearing in the same period. Same region, same time, same sudden absence in the fossil record. But this is what makes these two cases different from Neanderthals and Denisovans in a way that science has not yet explained. With Neanderthals we have evidence of interbreeding, their DNA in us, with Denisovans similarly. With Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis there is nothing. No evidence of massacre, no bones broken in a violent manner, no cut marks from weapons, no evidence of interbreeding. Not a single segment of DNA from these two species has been found in the genome of any modern person tested so far. No traces of technology, no evidence of cultural exchange, nothing measurable. They disappeared completely, in the literal sense and in the biological sense. In 2025, scientists confirmed that the Homo longi skull, also known as the dragon man found in China, was actually a Denisovan, a discovery that significantly expands the distribution map of Denisovans into East Asia and shows this species was larger than we thought. But even that discovery does not touch the question about floresiensis and luzonensis. The map of human species is increasingly filled with more details, but the most important gaps are still there and show no signs of being filled soon. Because the record of these two species leaves us with only one single observation with no explanation. Before we arrived, they were here. After we arrived, they were no longer here. No broken bones, no cut marks, no DNA remaining. Only absence. This is the darkest part of the story, not because we know what happened to them, but because we do not know, and perhaps never will. And this is something most people have never heard. The entire story we just went through, Homo sapiens meeting Neanderthals, interbreeding, competing, one side disappearing, leaving DNA in the other, we often accidentally think this is something special that Homo sapiens did to other species. But a study in Science Advances shows this loop had been running long before we appeared. The common ancestor of Neanderthals and Denisovans, before those two branches split, had interbred with an entirely isolated group of hominins from the early Pleistocene, estimated about 2.3 million years ago. This is the oldest hybridization event ever recorded in the history of the human family. And that hominin group, the species that left DNA traces in the ancestors of both Neanderthals and Denisovans, we do not know who they were, no name, no confirmed fossils. Only traces in the genomes of later species. The loop of meeting, interbreeding, one side disappearing, leaving DNA in the other. Homo sapiens did not invent this loop. We are only the newest loop in a chain much longer than our own history. And if we look at the entire chain, one thing becomes clear. There is no formula that guarantees survival. Homo erectus existed for nearly 2 million years with a body perfectly suited to their environment, then disappeared. Neanderthals endured hundreds of thousands of years of ice ages with brains equal to ours, then disappeared. Denisovans spread from Siberia to Southeast Asia with astonishing adaptability, leaving almost no fossils but leaving DNA in millions of people living today. No brain size, no length of existence, no physical strength guarantees you will still be here tomorrow. History belongs only to those who survive to tell it. We are not the first species to do this to another. We are also not the first species to receive it in return. This loop had been running before we existed and will not stop just because now there is only one human species left on this planet. Return to that afternoon on the savannah, two groups of creatures looking at each other across the riverbank. We know now what happened next, not one thing but everything all at once, in different places at different moments spanning tens of thousands of years. Interbreeding on the European plains, competition for prey on increasingly shrinking lands, disease spreading from one group to another with no one understanding why their own people kept dying, violence in a cave in Belgium where we still do not know who the perpetrator was. Gradual absorption through many generations of interbreeding until the boundary between the two species became so blurred it could no longer be drawn. And finally the absence, on distant islands in Southeast Asia with no evidence, no explanation, only silence in the fossil record. There are no heroes in this story, no villains, only creatures trying to survive in a world that suddenly became more crowded, and each species handling it in the only way they knew. So why are only we left? That question deserves a straightforward answer once. Not because we are smarter, evidence for that does not exist, and science is becoming increasingly clear on this point. Not because we are stronger or better adapted in the purely biological sense. Neanderthals survived ice ages we are not sure we could endure without modern technology. What may have made the difference is the hardest to measure and the least heroic. Luck, geography, and having enough numbers in the right place at the right time when everything came down. We were not destined to be the last ones standing. We just happened to be. That is a truth more uncomfortable than any story about human superiority, but it is also truer. The next time you catch the flu and your immune system starts reacting, fever, fatigue, the body mobilizing everything it has to fight what is invading, remember that part of that mechanism is not yours. It was given to you by someone who sat around a different bonfire on a different continent 47,000 years ago. Someone who met your ancestors, had children with them, and then disappeared from this world without leaving a name, without leaving a language, without leaving temples or books or anything we usually use to remember each other. They only left the one thing that cannot be erased by time or forgetting, or the disappearance of an entire species, a small segment in your genome. And today that small segment is keeping you alive. If you have just realized that you are carrying DNA from a species that went extinct 40,000 years ago, then perhaps you also want to know more about yourself that school never taught. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next video.